plugin of the week is the Slate Digital FG-116 Blue Series. Very recently added to the mix rack are two new additions, which is 1176 emulations that go back to the Blue Stripe or early revisions of the 1176. The 1176 was designed by Bill Putnam in the late 60s. And this was released in 1967. And it was part of a movement that was much bigger, where console manufacturers and designers of external hardware compressors were going more towards solid-state components and away from tubes. Part of this was really more about making them easier to maintain. And then there became a sonic aesthetic that also was kind of added in. So this was a very unique limiter at the time, where most of the limiters were driven by tubes, as in the Fairchild, or driven so Verimu style, or driven by optical components, as in the LA2A. This was something that was driven by FET circuit, or field effect transistor. The idea here and the benefit of this is that the control over the attack and release characteristics was completely different, much more aggressive and much faster, and the sound was very different. As part of this design, there are input and output transformers, which create a lot of tonal coloration, and then all of the amplification circuitry, the FET circuitry in the middle, which actually creates the sound. Now, what you have here, which I think is kind of cool, is he did, as Slate always does with his components, has created some unique features. The obvious one being the mix control, but otherwise the basic settings, the input, output, attack, and release, are essentially the same. The ratios that you see here, 4, 8, 12, and 20, are exactly the same as the original. The couple things that are different are there is a high-pass filter that can be placed into the sidechain. So what that does is it makes it a little bit more transient-driven and a little bit more active, a little bit less RMS-driven. And this is one of those things that, as engineers, when working with things, you would say, gee, I wish it could do this, or I wish it had sidechain capabilities, because then I could filter things down and get it to trigger a little bit more actively the way that I want. So this is kind of a very smart design element in here. And also, he found two of the Revision A units and modeled them independently. So what you have is two different sounds. What you'll find if you were actually to work with the original 1176s, any of the hardware, especially the vintage stuff, is that there would be a discrepancy or differences between the sounds. In other words, no two blue stripes would sound the same, or no two black faces would sound the same. They would all have a slightly different sound. Part of this is dependent upon its history, the degradation of components, et cetera, et cetera. So age plays a big part, especially now. I think in the second circuit, he had one that was not modified, but it was refurbished, and then one that was in original condition. So you get two different characteristics that are happening here. Now, when you work with this, there are a couple things to keep in mind. And not a lot of people are intimately familiar with the 1176 and how it works. When you actually work with the settings here, the attack time, being a fast attack, and I'll just kind of zoom in here for a second, on a fast attack is 7. So you would think that would be 1, but it's completely the opposite. So this is a slow attack, which ends up being 800 microseconds. So on the original hardware, it had an extremely fast attack at 20 microseconds. So it's like 20 millionths of a second. So it's, 0.02 milliseconds, just to kind of put it in perspective a little bit. And so that is the range, but there is a connection here, and I wasn't really fully aware of this. It is somehow linked to the release control. The release control on a fast setting runs at about 50 milliseconds, and on a slow setting goes all the way to 1.1 seconds. So it gives you a pretty broad range, and it's in that control that you find the power of the unit. Now, there are things that people and ways of using it that a lot of people don't really know about. And I'm going to show you some of the things here because they emulated them very well, and this is not true of all emulations. You have the 4 ratio controls. One thing that is left out here of note is the all feature, and it wasn't just an all feature because you could hit in different variations of buttons, but most people would push all 4 ratio buttons in, and what it would do is it would put it into a hyper compression mode, and you would get this really heavy, gritty harmonic distortion that a lot of people used for room sounds or drum compression, parallel chains and things like that. So it's a very common thing. Now, what Slate is doing here is they're actually going to release a whole separate module called the Monster, which will give you that feature. And that will have additional things. So just looking at the surface of it, you'll see that there is variable control on the sidechain filter, whereas here it's just an switch in and out and some other controls. You still have the mix control and all of that for parallel compression. So there's some components or things that are added in. Now, you get 2 with this blue series. You also get this solid blue colored one. And what this is like, what he calls kind of a custom modification. And what they've done is they've cleaned up the circuit design, in particular the output transformers cleaned up. So it's less gritty, a little bit more hi-fi sounding. And there are two variations of it here, but otherwise the controls are pretty much the same. Now, the FG-116 that you see here on the right is actually the original. So that's the blackface version. So that remains the same. I just have it here for demonstration purposes. And then perhaps we can do a little A, B, C, D, E with this, since we have 2 variations of each, and maybe we could set up some parallel settings. Another thing to note about the ratio is that when you change the ratio, it also changes the threshold. So the ratio exists, or the threshold exists on a knee, and you notice that there is no threshold control. So when you set the input gain, you're determining how much signal rises above threshold. And when you set the ratio, this actually also changes the threshold setting. Now, this is not an uncommon thing for vintage limiters. And the reason is that when you switch between different settings, so you have 2 compression settings, 4-to-1 and 8-to-1, or 2 limiter settings, 12-to-1, 20-to-1, when you switch between those different settings, when you go about them, by raising the threshold, you get consistent gain reduction. And then if you want to drive more gain reduction, you can raise the input level or take the output level away. So there's a thing on that where it exists on the knee where the compression is applied. And so when you put it on something like a vocal, sometimes you can get more warmth and grit or body by changing the ratio as opposed to changing the settings. And that's something that hopefully we'll have time to take a look at here. Now, there's one other thing there that you can do here, which is to turn this off. So if you hold the Shift key and you click on this, you can turn it off. So what does this do? It shuts off the compression circuitry. But what it doesn't do is it allows you to overdrive the transformer circuitry and electronics of it without actually applying any compression. And to get out of this, you shift click out and it will bring you back to the previous setting that you had. So this ends up being really cool because now you could use it as a pure harmonic distortion characteristic thing. And that doesn't exist on all units or all emulations. And, well, I wouldn't say it was the most commonly used feature. It was something that was used. All right, so let's get to some audio examples. I think I've yapped enough on this one. So let's kind of move along here. All right, so just here what I have is some drums. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with this. So what I have here is a slow attack and a fast release. And now if I push the high pass filter in, you'll notice that this will be a little more responsive. Which kind of opens up the sound a little bit. And so I just wanted to kind of show that. Now I'm just going to switch through the ratios real quick and notice that the gain reduction doesn't change a whole lot, but the characteristic tone starts to change a little bit. I really like what the 8-to-1 does to the snare drum in there. So you can see how that's like a way of kind of working that in. Now let's switch to the other circuit here and just notice how that affects the sound. You notice this has a little bit less distortion and a little bit richer low end and low mids. And so this is kind of the distinction of doing this. What I really like about this is that in setting up these different variations, you can use different modeling. So this gives you basically 5 variations. If you're working in a mix studio that had hardware gear, you would have 5 pieces of hardware that were 1176s, and it would be a little bit more realistic. So you weren't using like the exact same modeling on different instruments, which can create a little bit of a sameness kind of thing. Now, one of the other things that is interesting here, because I want to see how this sounds on the modern one. So this is the modified one. So if I go to similar settings here, and I'm just going to try to match what I have here, 27.8. So if I kind of put that in, or close enough, 16.8. And so what I want to do is I want to try to set up some kind of similar setting here with this fast attack or slow attack, fast release. Now, what Slate has done here is apparently there's a coupling of the attack and the release time. And this is something that I think I've noticed in terms of using it, but never knew that that was actually what's going on. So I don't know what the technical design of that is. But he's commenting on something that if that statement is correct, then what happens is the attack characteristic changes as you adjust the release characteristic. And what he's doing is he's decoupling that. And I guess what that theoretically, if I understand it correctly, is meant to do is it would give you slower attack times, something that would be greater than 1 millisecond, which doesn't exist. There was an anniversary edition that was released in that actually had a modified feature in that would give you, I believe, a 10 millisecond attack time. It was a switched setting in place of the off switch. So let's check this out, see what's going on with this. Go back to the beginning here. It's switch a little A-B between circuit 1 and 2. So you get a little bit of an idea. Like they sound different. I'm not sure which one I like better. This is a grittier sound. This is definitely a cleaner sound. And we could set up a similar type of thing here. One thing that's cool about this is that in setting up some of these settings, when you set the numbers, they actually are the same. And one of the things that was always a common characteristic of them was that when you worked on then you could set the actual hardware knobs in the same position and the gain structure would be completely different. That was like one of the more common things. But this is the blackface. The blackface was what they call it, the 1176 LN. It was a low noise. Has less of the rich harmonic distortion you get from the blue stripe. This is more of an aggressive attack style. It's got a warmer characteristic to it. And this adds like an interesting sheen that this one doesn't have. It has a warmer, this has a more open top end. And then you hear the grit coming more from here. It's kind of like it gives you a lot of flavors and different colorations and things to work with. I've always been a big fan of the 1176 on drums and like parallel things. And I wanted to show you one quick thing here just before wrapping up this review here. And that is, I'm just going to click on it here to put it in the offsetting just to kind of show you a little bit of one way that you can use this purely as a distortion type of thing where you really drive the input. And you have like, over 40 dB of gain on this. So it gives you like almost mic level gain control. This is a way of overdriving the circuitry. So no compression at all. So you see there's no gain reduction. And then I could mix in however much of that I wanted to. And that'll give you like a little bit of grit and it's okay for this. This particular example wasn't the perfect example for that, but that's a little known feature, that, might not necessarily be the most obvious one. And it's one that's really cool to kind of point out in this if you're using it, because it's really a simple compressor when you think about it. It's just like 4 ratio on some radio buttons, input, output level control, attack, release. There's nothing overly sophisticated in terms of the design, but when you get into some of the intricacies of it, particularly with the threshold changing with the different ratios, you get different characteristic settings, or attack and release. And now you have the different circuits you can choose, the high pass filter, which makes it more responsive, and then you also get the ability to kind of drive the circuitry with this, taken out. So it's really, really cool. There's a lot of flexibility within this, and you could do the same with the blue. You cannot do this currently. Maybe Mr. Slate will modify that in some revision down the line for the blackface. But a very cool one. Nice addition to the collection. This has been talked about for a little while, so it's a welcome release. And there you have it. That is the FG-116 blue stripe, the vintage and the modern edition. And that is the Mixing with Mike plugin of the week.